Welcome back, everyone. Now that we've learned about consumption in the simple Keynesian model, let's look at the other component of what's happening inside our GDP, which is the behavior from firms. Firms also engage in acquisition of new final goods and services. And in order to understand what's happening there, just remind ourselves that we call expenditures, or we call like acquisitions of new final goods and services by firms, investment. And I'm going to call that I for investment. Unfortunately, it's really going to be crucial to remember that by definition, since output goes somewhere, that figure I that you see in your real GDP data, remember some of it is what I'm going to call planned investment. And some of this could be a result of unplanned inventory accumulation, or, as you're going to find out when we come to the segment on Keynesian equilibrium, it can also come from unexpected reductions in inventories, where firms had planned investment and planned inventories, and they weren't able to meet those plans, right? So planned investment is what the firms would like to do. There's going to be a portion of the RGDP which might be what the firms did not intend to do or plan to do. So we're going to have to come up with a distinction between the I that you just see in the numbers when you look at data in your national income accounts on GDP, and planned investment, the element in that which is what the firms wanted to do. So with that in mind, let's make sure that remembering that planned investment is not the same thing as actual investment, which is what you see in the RGDP numbers. Let's take a look at I, and for now, I'm just going to make sure I put that P over there to remind myself that I'm talking about planned investment. Just like households have consumption functions, behavior of households, planned investment is coming from the behavior of firms. And it is a function of quite a few things. Firms' investment plans will depend on expectations of future sales. Firms' investment plans will depend on assumptions about future price levels. They might have dependence on technological options, other forms of costs, and so on. And so this is something that at the micro level you tend to focus on individual firms' decisions about, should I go ahead and produce apples, or is it better for me to go and open a banana plantation instead, right? That kind of micro level decision about which market do I want to be in, and firms are entering and exiting markets in order to do that. But remember, in macro, we're looking at all firms put together, not individual small firms, but all firms put together, and asking, once I take the entire firm sector into account, what determines the total volume of investment plans people are making, not just for this or that industry, but for the overall economy. And just as there are very many factors that can affect for household decisions, there are many factors that can affect firm decisions. The one that I'm going to focus on is R, and I'm going to use R to show the rate of interest, and that's because I has already been used for investment. And because there are all these other factors, I'm going to ceteris paribus. And the reason I want to focus on R, or interest rate, is that the interest rate is a good reflection of the firm's cost through borrowing. The idea is that planned investment does depend on the interest rate because firms have to borrow in order to finance their investment. And then when they finance their investment, they're going to have to pay back an interest rate in the future to pay off their borrowing. So they're now going to go ahead and do overall investment unless they have a feeling that the investment that they do will give them a rate of return that is at least as high as the interest that they're going to have to pay today. So the basic idea is that if I think of investment, firms have different investment plans, different expectations, and what they come up with is a schedule of expected returns. And as long as my expected return for an investment plan is higher than the interest rate, that means it's going to make me a profit in the future and I'll go ahead and do investment. But if my expected return is not that high compared to the interest rate, that means that it's not going to make sense for me to borrow, because the amount that I would have to repay is going to be higher than the expected return I would get from my investment decision today. All right. Now, the thing to remember before we go any further is that investment, as used here, literally means a firm decision to go ahead and do some kind of financing, whatever that is, to actually go ahead and acquire new final goods and services. Do not ever confuse this, which is the macroeconomic concept of investment, with stocks and bonds or financial markets, right? Borrowing and lending in financial markets is not the same thing as investment, which is what we mean by investment in macroeconomics. Because what happens in financial markets essentially is a shifting of funds, borrowing and lending across people. Whether or not it ends up becoming investment depends on someone actually taking that borrowing and then using it to go and acquire new final goods and services. If I borrowed it and I went to gamble it away in a casino, it's borrowing, but it's not actually what I would call investment. So investment is when firms themselves actually do the acquisition of new final goods and services, when they actually go ahead and build plants, buildings, inventory, accumulation, all of planning, preparation for Christmas sales season, all of that. That is what I'm going to call investment, because that actually is what will result in production, right? Not borrowing and lending, not financial assets. So we're going to use the word assets or financial assets for a lot of the things that you often think of as investment in your personal life. And in macroeconomics, we're going to reserve the word investment for firm behavior in acquiring or planning to acquire new final goods and services. Right? So with that in mind, let's just say what firms have is what the book calls an investment schedule. Sometimes it's called an investment schedule, an investment plan. And this is an idea of the level of investment that a firm may wish to engage in, right? So what you do is you've got certain plans, and what you're going to say is that it depends on the rate of return, all right? And as the interest rate drops, what that would mean is that more and more types of investment, I'm going to call that planned investment, and I'm going to have the interest rate here. I'm back to putting R on the y-axis and planned investment on the x-axis, because this is an actual demand schedule where R is the price of investment. Right. So what happens is at a very high interest rate, there aren't going to be that many investment projects that will give me a high enough rate of return. All right. So this is probably going to look like that. But as my interest rate drops, more and more projects will turn out to become profitable, because projects with a lower rate of return suddenly now turn out to be profitable because the interest rate is not that high. Right? So with this in mind, the overall argument is that as the interest rate drops, planned investment goes up. Right? But remember, when I go back to my other graph, that in my consumption graph, I had said that I'm going to hold prices constant, right? So when I come back to the Keynesian system, we're going to have to keep that in mind. So this is planned investment. pretty much. So now that I have a sense of the behavior of households and the behavior of firms, what I can do now is to think about, okay, so what is the total desired volume of purchase in this economy, right? And so what I'm going to say is that, well, households have their plans and they wish to consume a certain amount based on an income level, right? And then firms have their plans and they wish to acquire goods and services based on their plans. And I am going to call this C plus IP aggregate expenditures, right? And I have to remember that aggregate expenditures is the planned level of acquiring new final goods and services in the economy. It's different than the actual production level because the actual production level depends on actual investment and not on planned investment. Keynes called this the ex post, after the fact, level of investment that happened to come together in an economy, versus the ex ante, the before the fact, desired or planned level of output and investment that people might want in the economy. So this is very important because remember when you did your real GDP C plus I, that's not the same thing, that was Y. C plus IP, that's what I'm going to call planned aggregate expenditures, often called AE, right? So one final item we're going to add here is that right now the way I have set this up, consumption depends on the income level. Planned investment depends on the interest rate, but because I'm going to hold prices and interest constant, what that means is basically it's coming from those markets and there's a certain investment level plan. If there is going to be a change in that market, then this will change, right? And when I put these plans together, I'm going to call it aggregate expenditures. So we now have consumption, we have planned investment, and we have aggregate expenditures. Let us see if we can put this all together to come to our next video, which will be about equilibrium in the Keynesian system.